Hello, I'm Jacob Carell, and the title of my project is an exploratory study of big data frameworks, and my supervisors were Fahim Ullah and Professor Ali Baba. So big data is utilized in many industries, including advertising, mining, defense, and medicine, and its value is expected to be $103 billion by 2023. And there are many different frameworks available for big data, and developers will often seek to find solutions to issues they have on forums. And we will explore these forums in order to understand how each framework is used. And in particular, looking at the frameworks Spark, Hadoop, Flink, and Storm. And by looking at these forums, we want to answer the following 5 research questions, which are: which topics are discussed for each framework? What are the popularity and difficulty of them? How does the popularity relate to the difficulty? And what are the popular programming languages used on each framework? So why do we want to know this? Well, each framework has its own unique strengths and weaknesses. And picking the right framework is important depending on what task you wish to achieve. So by understanding more about how these frameworks are used, developers will be able to better assess the trade-off between them and pick the right one for their job. So here's a brief overview of the methodology that we used to answer these questions, and I'll go over this in more detail in the coming slides. So data collection is the first step we took. In order to achieve this, we used a combination of web crawlers, which we implemented through a library called Scrapy. And we also used a pre-existing data set that included posts related to Hadoop and Spark on Stack Overflow. And in total, we collected 150,000 posts from Apache mailing list and 110,000 posts from Stack Overflow. So once we collected the data, we needed to clean it. And to do this, we first applied lemmatization to it, which we did through a Python library called Spacey. And what lemmatization does is it converts words to their root form. So you can see an example there. And it does this by using a library of common English words with their roots. And then next, we used a bash script to remove URLs, emails, and dates. And finally, we removed stop words and did lowercase conversion. So once the data was clean, we used it to create topic models. And we did this using an algorithm called latent direct allocation. This basically just looks at words that are commonly used together and then groups them into topics. In total, we chose to create 25 topics, and each topic needs to be manually labeled based on the 20 most common words in that topic. For popularity, we looked at 3 metrics, which were the amount of posts per month, the average number of replies a post for the framework would receive, and the number of unique users asking questions related to the framework. And for difficulty, we had 2 metrics, which were the percentage of questions that received answers and the average time it took for a question to receive an answer. And then to relate popularity to difficulty, we use Kendall rank correlation, which looks at the ranking of one metric and compares it to the rankings of another metric and assigns a value from somewhere between -1 and 1. And then finally, we selected 9 languages based on which languages were supported or suggested for each framework. And then we looked at how many times each of these languages was mentioned in the body of posts relating to each framework. So now we can go on to results. But firstly, the topic model, each post is defined as a composition of different topics. And we're interested in the average composition of a post. And we don't have time to go over the composition of all frameworks, but here is what the composition of Spark posts look like on Stack Overflow. And then some interesting topics from each framework. Spark was mostly about clusters, RDD, which is their resilient distributed data sets, and then machine learning. Hadoop was mainly about the Hadoop file system and MapReduce. Flink, some popular topics were data streaming and checkpoints. And then on Storm, popular topics were killing or restarting processes, managing worker CPU usage, and node topology. And then common topics in general were versions and dependencies, the HDFS, Java and SQL, and then Kafka, which is an Apache library for data streaming. So here we can see the number of posts each framework received on the two data sources. So as we can see, Spark is popular on both of the forums. Will achieve the peak popularity on both forums, and it goes through a rapid rise through 2013, 2014. And then Hadoop is kind of mid-range on both the forums. And then we can see that Storm is quite unpopular on both forums, more so on Stack Overflow. And then on Stack Overflow, Flink is very unpopular, but on Apache mailing list, its popularity actually rises and it becomes the #1 in terms of posts per month. And then we look at how many answers each question is received. And we can see that on average, questions posted on the Apache mailing list for all frameworks receive more answers. But Flink was the one that received most answers overall on the Apache mailing list. And then next popularity metric, we looked at the number of unique people asking questions related to each framework. As you can see, by most, Spark and Hadoop on Stack Overflow had the most users by far, with about 20,000 each. But interestingly, Flink on the Apache mailing list only had 2,000 users, but each of them asked an average of 4 questions, which is much higher than all the other frameworks. So the final rankings for popularity, we have Spark, then Hadoop, and finally Flink and Storm. Now we look at the difficulty. So as you can see, the framework that received the most answers on average across both forums was Flink, with 82.68% of questions being answered on average across both the data sources. But as you can see, depending on the data source, the amount of questions that received an answer, the percentage of questions receiving an answer can change quite a lot, even for the same framework. And then next, we looked at how long it took for a question to receive an answer on average. So as you can see, this is in hours. Interestingly, on Apache mailing list, Hadoop and Spark, they took above 30 hours on average to receive an answer. But on Stack Overflow, it was much less, with about like 16 to 13 hours-ish between them. So that's interesting to note. And then our final rankings for popularity were Spark was the hardest, then Storm, Hadoop, and finally Flink was the easiest from our observations. And then we relate the difficulty to the popularity. As you can see on Apache mailing list, there wasn't strong correlation between the difficulty or popularity metrics. But on Stack Overflow, both the popularity metrics were strongly inversely correlated to the time for an answer, meaning the more popular a framework was, the less time it took to receive an answer on average. And then if we use the final ratings, we have the popularity and difficulty. They were correlated about 0.33, which is not a strong correlation. And then finally, this is the languages, how often each language was mentioned for the 4 frameworks on the Apache mailing list. And as you can see, Java is very dominant, but Python and SQL are also quite popular. And then on Stack Overflow, Java is less prominent, but still by far the most popular across the frameworks. So we can see on Spark and Flink, Scala is also quite popular. And then SQL also popular on all except Storm. So what is some future work we could do? Well, we could look at more frameworks. We could incorporate more data sources to see how they compare. And also we could explore topics in more detail. So what this means is we could look at the difficulty of individual topics and their popularity as well. And we could also see if topics can be broken down into subtopics. And that is the end. Thank you for listening.